Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of AOB Experts. I'm your host Mark Brooks, and today we are visited today by Dr. Barry Seiller from Visual Edge. Now, Visual Edge is a really interesting platform. It's a computer-based 3D visual performance assessment test that you can take online, and it's going to essentially quantify where you stand as a player in regards to his hand-eye coordination. So Dr. Barry Seiller is going to be talking to us a little bit about the role that EyeSight plays with baseball players from around the world, and we're going to try to bridge the gap between the two. So stay tuned. This is a great episode. I have Dr. Barry Seiller here, owner of Visual Edge. Hey, Dr. Barry, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks, Mark.
We really appreciate you coming out here. I've got some, really interesting questions, specifically with the relationship that healthy eyesight has with performance on the field, with the sport of baseball. And before we kind of get into it, because we're going to dive right in here, before we get into discussions about the causes of poor eyesight and what players can do in modern times, let's kind of talk about the role that eyesight has, because I know that there's been a lot of emphasis on specific mechanics for hitting. There hasn't been a lot of emphasis on eye training. So can you kind of talk to us about the role that eye training has?
Sure. Mark, when you think about what separates a good athlete or a good baseball player from a great one, I mean, it's not only obviously their mechanics and their motivation and their nutrition, but most frequently it's also their visual skills. It's either their eyesight or the rest of their visual skills, and we sort of separate those two, even though they're basically connected. The eyesight is the foundation of your visual system. And then all the other visual skills such as depth perception, tracking a ball, near to far focusing, visual recognition, and where your eyes actually line up on the ball are all other components of that visual system. And what we're interested in not only is in the eyesight part, but also in those visual skills. And we have a method of taking those visual skills and measuring them, essentially dissecting them apart, and then either enhancing them or improving them if they're essentially deficient. And then reassembling them and putting it back together again. This can be done on a computerized based program that's internet available, so that athletes from anywhere, baseball players particularly, from anywhere, their dorm, their home, their training facility, can go ahead and do an evaluation or have an evaluation done on them, and then go ahead and train those visual skills to make them better. Okay. And it doesn't take a ton of time in the training, but we'll get into that a little bit later.
Right.
But what I wanted to mention to you is about eyesight. And as I said, eyesight is the basic foundation of this. If you don't have 20/20 or 20/15, or which is essentially normal vision, you're going to go ahead and have a lower ceiling than somebody who has good eyesight.
Right.
And so it's imperative that eyesight actually be tested by athletes or by their trainers or their team members, to go ahead and see if it needs to be corrected before they do anything else. Mm-hmm. And it throws everything else off. It throws your depth perception off. It throws your ability to see off. And it's most likely more related to nighttime or when it's overcast. Everybody sees great when it's bright and sunny. Mm-hmm. When it's dark or overcast, or you're playing a night game and the lighting isn't good, that's when it's going to show up.
Right.
And as an example of that, we work for 9 Major League Baseball teams who use our visual performance program. And every one of their scouts, and that's probably then 350 or 400 scouts, have our program in their laptop to test players visually besides physically. And they also have an eye chart with them. Mm-hmm. So before they test anything, they test their player's eyesight. And if it's below par, they're going to say, go get an eye exam somewhere and get corrected, and then we'll test you then.
Fantastic. And so, it's interesting when you mentioned depth perception and visual contrast, because is it true that, I mean, technically you could have 20/20 vision or 20/15 vision, and yet if you're struggling in these other facets of your eyesight, you could still not be seeing the ball as effectively as you could?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, people are obviously interested in seeing when a pitch ball, for instance, the trajectory of the spin on the ball, the rotation. Some people claim they obviously can see the laces on the ball, and you're not going to be able to do that even though you have 20/20 vision if all these other visual components aren't good or better than they should be.
Right, and so that's what baseball players should be focusing on, not just healthy eyesight. Whenever you go to the doctor for an eye exam, you want to talk about these other facets. Okay.
And they're not traditionally checked when you go to the doctor's office.
Exactly.
They're just traditionally checking you for glasses, contact lenses, that sort of thing, but they don't traditionally check you for these other visual skills that are just as important as your basic eyesight.
Okay, so let's say a baseball player or a parent is aware of this and they want to go out and do something about it. Specifically, what would they have to do as far as, would they just go to an eye clinic and say, hey, do you offer these sort of eye exams? Or?
Well, you can probably go look in your yellow pages or online to see who in your area is offering sports vision training, and go to the doctor's office that does that and see about getting a program with them. But what we've done is to try to eliminate and make it a lot more not only affordable, but also more convenient for these athletes, because they can do this program essentially on their own at home. Right. They don't have to go to the doctor's office 2 or 3 times a week, and they're not paying exorbitant fees to go ahead and do this. And so they can go ahead and do this on their own, as I mentioned, any place they are. I mean, we have teams that have buses fitted with internet connections, and so they're actually training on the bus while they're going from one game to another.
Wow, that's fantastic. Okay, so let's kind of segue here into prevention. We're in this age where everything is, go, 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 go. Are there any ways, or are there any interesting kind of tips that you can provide us about preventing further decline in eyesight?
I'm not really sure what you mean. Obviously, if your eyesight, if you wear correction, it's not unusual that at the age of anywhere between 10 and 20 that your eyesight might continue to deteriorate once you wear your correction, and you have to just keep up with it. Why don't you try to clarify that a little bit for me, if you would?
Sure. I mean, I know that a lot of kids nowadays are playing video games or watching TV. You've heard some sort of stigmas about that and how that kind of decreases eyesight. But would you say that's more of an untested assumption, or is there some truth to that?
No, I think actually there's some truth to the fact that there's been one study that I'll present during my presentations about video gamers having quicker eyes than people who don't play video games.
Interesting.
And so, parents will come to the office, and I'm an ophthalmologist, so, I see regular routine patients, and they'll try to go ahead and get me to say something to their children about, well, don't use video games, don't watch TV so often, that sort of thing. But actually, it actually stimulates your eyesight and your tracking ability and your eye movements by seeing the scroll across the bottom of the ESPN screen, or playing video games, which make you faster in hand-eye coordination. We actually did a study with all our Latin American players, and you know how many there are these days. And we did a study with our program with the Milwaukee Brewers, where all their players that came from Latin America, particularly the Dominican Republic, we found that their eyesight was much, much worse than naturally born Hispanic players.
Interesting.
And we think that that's probably related to either cultural or environmental conditions or even nutritional conditions. And so a lot of those guys will wash out early because of their lack of visual skills.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have early reading programs in the Dominican. They don't watch TV in the Dominican. They don't play video games as much. And so they don't have that early stimulation of their vision.
Right. That's interesting. So, you mentioned nutrition. Let's talk about that for a second. What role would you say nutrition has in eye development?
Well, at the age of normal baseball players, it doesn't have a great deal to do with it.
Okay.
Certainly, you know, you've read about eat your carrots, that
Right.
sort of thing. So you have vitamin C and vitamin A, and just a regular diet that will cause you to have decent eyesight. It's just when people get much older and their degeneration of their retina and their eye becomes more prevalent,
Mm-hmm.
that's when they'll need more specific vitamins, particularly luteins like spinach, kale, green vegetables, that sort of thing. And the other thing, of course, that's important that I need to mention to you is that the high rate of eye disease related to ultraviolet light. And so
Okay.
you have players playing outside all the time, and if they're not wearing sunglasses with the UV filters, and almost all sunglasses have UV filters in them these days, they're going to cause themselves some long-term problems of when they get older, of cataracts and some other types of eye diseases.
Right. So it's important to wear sunglasses, especially in during the summer when you're playing doubleheaders, or even in the fall playing doubleheaders. Great. Awesome.
And actually, you know, there's some work that we've done at our facility that's called the Visual Fitness Institute, where we have shown that certain tints are much better than other tints,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the lighting conditions.
Right.
In other words, if the lighting conditions are low, you're not going to want to wear as dark a tint as you would if there's a bright sunny day with no clouds.
Right. Great. All right. I only got a couple more questions for you. Let's talk a little bit about visual edge and some of the exercises and training that's in there. Let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about what purposes those specific trainings serve. So, can you kind of tell us what visual edge is, and how it started?
Well, Visual Edge started because I had been at the Olympics a number of times as an eye doctor,
Okay.
and found that a lot of people, when we tested them from all around the world, wouldn't test well on our systems that we had at that time, which were somewhat rudimentary in measuring their visual skills.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what happened was there were very few places around that you could go to. So we put together a program that was first on a DVD and then on in the internet, so that you could get availability of these services where you could measure your visual skills on your own, or go to a facility that has Visual Edge, and there's probably about 50 or 75 facilities around the country. Actually, it's around the world these days.
Mm-hmm.
And where you can go get an analysis or do it on your own and then train on your own. And the training doesn't take much time. It's only 2 to 3 times a week for 15 to 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we found that 2 to 3 times a week is probably the adequate amount, but we have pro ball players all the time that train every day because they think that it's really changed their visual confidence
Mm-hmm.
and consistency. But we have no data that shows that's maybe more superstition than it is
Right.
training less time.
But that's the kind of the advantage, you know, if you have a processy that's something that you can do before the game that increases your confidence, then that's a valuable asset to have. It's just another advantage that, you know, you can give yourself. So I can completely understand why they do that, because I was kind of a creature of habit as well.
Yes, and so it's what we do is sort of a tight fit with sports psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And so the program is more video game like, but very serious. We have thousands and thousands of athletes using the program, so we have a huge database, and we can then measure all these skills and compare them to our database, so the athlete can be compared to another athlete, just like in the drafting process. When teams are drafting players, they'll look at their visual scores besides some of their other scores. And the other thing is that these skills are somewhat unique. So your first baseman and your third baseman may have totally different visual systems.
Right.
And what you have is, let me just go off on a little bit of a tangent, you have hitting instructors that teach one way. And that may not be the optimum way for that person's visual system. They may be more comfortable. So you'll see head positions, you'll see people will have different stances based on where they think that they get the best look at the ball.
Right.
We're into binocularity. In other words, we're into how well you use your two eyes together. So one of the questions that always comes up, and I'm surprised you haven't asked me about it yet, is something called dominant eye. And everybody's always asking about dominant eye, you know, whether you're a right-handed hitter, and if your dominant eye is your left eye, do you have an advantage because it's closer to the pitcher than if you were a left-handed hitter or you were dominant in the other eye?
Right.
And all the studies really have shown that the most important thing is getting both eyes on the ball so that you get a good vision of depth, your depth perception is adequate.
Interesting. Okay.
And so if that comes up in conversation, you'll know that all the studies, none of them have shown that people are any better hitters if they have right eye dominant versus left eye dominant.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that's one of the things that I kind of teach, or the advice that I give with some of the younger players who are experimenting with switch hitting. Keeping in mind that one of the reasons is because maybe they're a right-handed hitter with a dominant right eye. They want to turn around on the other side of the plate so they can have that dominant eye facing the pitcher. But it makes complete and total sense. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of clears a few things up. So let's talk a little bit about some of the exercises. And I know I've actually done some of the training inside Visual Edge. Thought it was fantastic. Obviously I'm kind of old school. Whenever I was a kid, a lot of the coaches would give us a few eye training exercises that we could do that were kind of made popular by Edgar Martinez back in the early 90s, where because he had the lazy eye, and so he would basically take the string with the beads. Can you talk to us about that, and do you think there's any value in doing those sorts of exercises as well?
Well, I think that you'll find that if you have nothing else that you can use, those items might be good, and that's called a Brock string, B-R-O-C-K, string with the 3 beads, and you string the string from one side of the room to your nose, and you look at the one bead and then another bead and back and forth as you're helping near to far focusing. The other things that people could go ahead and do one is called a pencil push-up. In other words, you take and look at the writing on the pencil, and then you move it towards you until it blurs. And then you move it out again until you see it and move it until it blurs. Or you could use 2 pencils, and you would focus on the far pencil, and if you ever notice this, the near pencil looks double. And then you would focus on the near pencil, and actually the far pencil looks double.
Right.
So you would focus one to the other, one to the other. Other kinds of training, you could take a wiffle ball and tie it to a string and hang it from the ceiling and put some colored stickers on it with either letters or numbers and spin it and see if you can come up with seeing how many of those you can. Now those are all generic exercises. In other words, that's one size fits all. There's no way to gauge how well that's doing and if it's doing anything. And that's why the program, the Visual Edge program, is so successful, because it collects measurements. And anytime you have measurements, you can do research like we've done tons of research and showing that how effective it is, or you can compare your scores to somebody else, or you can go ahead and monitor your training and see how well you're doing.
Right. Awesome. Well, I just wanted to make sure that we link all this down below. It's visualedge.com with a Z. Is that correct?
Right, VIZUALEDGE.com.
Okay.
And for, not only for your listeners or viewers, I'm sorry, that might be players, but if there's a facility out there that's interested in offering cutting edge technology to their athletes, they can also contact us, because they can go ahead and use it on all their players and help separate themselves from the training place down the street.
Fantastic. All right, so yeah, we'll make sure that we link all those down below in the show notes. Do you guys have like a Facebook or Twitter that people can reach out to you on, or is it best by email or by phone?
It's best really by going onto our website, because
Okay.
it's extremely educational. The program is really sort of touchy-feely. It's very difficult to describe until you go through it. Maybe you experienced that, and when you went through it, you had a much better understanding of it. But the website is extremely educational, www.visualedge.com.
Okay.
It'll give you all sorts of questions, answers, and everything else.
Fantastic. All right, Dr. Barry Seiller here. I really appreciate your time.
All right, thanks, Mark.
All right, bye-bye.